Welcome to Heliotropes. My name is Julia.
And my name's Kwadjo.
And we're back again.
Yes.
And maybe we'll be back regularly, maybe we won't.
Yes.
Today we're going to talk about abortion and whatever comes up and that follows that from our conversation around that. On Friday, the Supreme Court in the U.S. overturned Roe and determined that it was up to the states to decide abortion rights. And for several states, that meant trigger laws to ban abortion. Some other states had already created laws to ban abortion. And then there's some states in which abortion rights are protected within the state's laws. And then there's, I think, like 26 states maybe where there's still a big question mark about what's going to happen, including in Georgia, where, we live in one of them right now. Abortion is legal in the state of Georgia up until 20 weeks. There is the heartbeat bill that was they attempted to pass, I don't remember when, last year or the year before, maybe 2 years ago, to ban abortion after 6 weeks in the state of Georgia. And I believe people are working to get that passed since Roe has been overturned by the Supreme Court.
And sorry, I have COVID. For those who, I guess not even for those who don't know, this decision was foreshadowed about 2 months ago when a draft, the first draft of the decision to overturn Roe was leaked to the public, which caused a lot of consternation. And, I know at that time there was, obviously a lot of concern that, the ultimate decision in the draft, which was to overturn Roe, was going to make it into law. There was hope that they would change it. I know, and this is my bad call for the past several years, I really didn't think this would happen. And, it goes to show what I know. So, please disregard everything I've said in the past 20 whatever episodes. I'll do my best to be right about things from this day forward. And as far as stuff to discuss, we definitely have a lot that we will discuss in this episode. I think it's important to keep in mind, one, the consequences, of course, of this decision. And that's the local and the, what do they say, proximal and the distal consequences, right? What's happening in the short term, what's happening in the long term, what's happening on the small scale to individuals, right? To people who need abortions, to families who need abortions, and then what's happening in the macro, right? What does society look like when abortion's mandated? What does, not mandated, when it's prohibited? So, that stuff. And then I'd also like to look at, just the political and ideological landscape of who's advocating for abortion, who's advocating for abortion restrictions, right? Who's, what do they call them? Pro-life, right? Anti-choice folks. Anti-abortion folks, yeah. Who are they? What are they gunning for? Pun intended. Really pun unintended, but, there's the Venn diagram, So, we can get to that stuff in a bit.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the consequences, too, there's also international consequences, right? A lot of countries and places look to the United States as a democracy and as something to live up to, foolishly. But so there's also going to be consequences internationally, too, in terms of abortion rights that will ripple out from here as well. I think it's important. You're right in the way that this was foreshadowed with the leak. And also it's something that a group of people have been, really the Christian right, have been working diligently towards for decades now at this point. And so this isn't a surprise for many folks, and I think there's a race division in that as well. And there, I mean, I don't know how we're going to talk about all these different things, but like a lot of white feminism is like, again, like just bubbling up and doing all sorts of annoying shit. I was going to try really hard to be more specific in my language today. But that's what's going on, and harmful and dangerous stuff too, right? That's like taking away resources or like distracting people or sending people in the wrong direction, when a lot of Black and brown women have been on the ground doing a lot of organizing around abortion access for years and years and years, and preparing for this moment because people knew it was coming, right? Not Kwadjo per se, but right, like a lot of us knew that this was coming. So, yeah, I just think that's important to point out, that this is something that has been coming for decades, and something that could have been stopped also for decades, nationally and at the state level too.
And I think that's, I mean, one of the things that even now, like, I understand that people saw this as inevitable. I wonder if it was, like, because obviously, this is politics. All right, so here's my interpretation of it. It's political games with, really dire consequences for actual people, as tends to be the case with politics. So I wonder if, right, I mean, several things, right? Like, yes, on the one hand, we could say that if we subscribe to, I would call it a reality that the way Roe v. Wade was written, and I'm not going to go into detail about that, but, the justices in this court, the justices in the court that published Roe v. Wade, recognized that the legal wording was weak, right? And that it needed to be strengthened. And that it wasn't, that it wasn't secure, right? In like securing rights. It's not the kind of thing where it's like, oh, okay, this is codified, right? And then it's going to be really hard to undo that. It's like, this is kind of flimsy wording. It'll pass right now by whatever ratio decision, but because it's so flimsy, it could topple, right? I think there's that. And then I also wonder, like you said, Obama had an opportunity. I mean, you didn't mention Obama, but, old boy did have an opportunity to codify, abortion protections, right? Like, codify access protections.
It wasn't his priority.
It wasn't his priority.
But he had a lot to say, the other day.
As he tends
to do. As did
his
wife. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean, and, he's not the only one, right? Roe v. Wade, Bill Clinton was also a Democratic president. Jimmy Carter, from what I understand, was also a Democratic president, right? Like, any of them. And even, like, conservatives back then were more liberal than today's conservatives, Like, there's any number of presidents who could have done any number of things to codify those protections. And then taken away from the executive branch, right? There's also this piece around how we're allowing this over-reliance on the Supreme Court to dictate law, right? To, through judicial review, to decide what is and isn't law, right? Mm-hmm. Like, and we've mentioned this on the podcast before, thinking about how many politicians, right? Congresspeople, representatives, senators run on platforms, not necessarily platforms of, but platforms including, right, this like liberal idea of, I'm pro-choice, right, pro bodily autonomy, right? A lot of politicians run on that kind of rhetoric. And in just as much time as all of those presidents have had the opportunity to do something, all of these politicians have also had the opportunity to do something. And, this is the result, right? Is that at no point has any federal law, protecting abortion access in any way been passed since Roe v. Wade, right? So that's a question that must be asked, is like, what good are elected officials if they're going to run on platforms that they don't adhere to,
And to be clear, that have popular support.
Right.
I mean, 2/3 at least of Americans support abortion rights in some capacity.
Right.
And so like that, I mean, that is a popular opinion. So the other piece of this is that like a small group of people in this country are anti-abortion and pro-forced birth, right? So and that is, I mean, it's a minority that's now become law. And I think the point that you made too, this over-reliance on the Supreme Court, right? There's this, and I had to check myself the other day too, because there's this maybe like belief or whatever it is that people think like they are like the law of the land. They're one branch of the government, right? They're not the law of the land. I mean, that whole shit needs to be overhauled anyways, but like they're just a part of it. And all of the other parts of the government can push back against it, including the president can push back and say like that, I mean, and really could take significant actions to demonstrate if he is actually, pro-choice, his values and principles in a really meaningful way that would actually give people access to reproductive health care. And push back against the court in different ways too. That would make it known that they don't just get to do whatever they want. But, like that hasn't happened. And I was going to say, obviously, I don't think that's obvious to a lot of people, but Joe Biden is not a pro-choice president and does not give a fuck about reproductive rights. I mean, that has like been entirely clear his entire career. Yeah. I mean, he has fought against it. He has said that he does not think that, and I think his quote is like, women should have a say, like should be the only people that have a say in abortion. Obviously, we know that like women are not the only people impacted by reproductive rights. That's another conversation. Another part of this same conversation. Yeah, so I like that's important, like to check yourself around too. And I mean, Nancy Pelosi just spent a bunch of time in Texas. So did other Democrats supporting an anti-choice Democrat, right? And making all these comments about, well, like the Democratic Party doesn't need to be pro-choice. And I think an important thing to remember about that is that is not, and like being liberal is a problem, but that is a conservative point of view. Like a lack of bodily autonomy is a conservative thing, belief, value. What do you call it when you run on something? I mean, damn.
So, I mean, as far as getting into the ideology and kind of building on what you just put out there, because, it can be confusing for people. We've talked about this in previous podcasts as well, is how the terms that we use to describe certain features, aspects of our political landscape, the terms themselves are ubiquitous, right? So we tend to use them like this and that. We just throw them out there. But like, you go and ask someone, what does it actually mean to be a conservative, right? And outside of pointing to someone they know who's a conservative and like, citing whatever their ideas are, they can't actually tell you. So conservatism, and this is to Julia's point, because I think that's accurate. Conservatism versus like liberalism, and I guess we don't even need to get into liberalism, but conservatism refers to this idea of limited government involvement in the lives of the people, right? So conservatism is small government, is associated with things like small government, lower tax, right? The things that happen when you have small government, right? If your government's not taxing you a whole lot, that's small government. If they're not taxing you at all, that's a very small government, If they're not providing any infrastructure, right? Or building things or hiring people, that's very small government, right? So all of these things are conservative ideas. The government is pretty hands-off and allows you to do your thing. Now, keeping in mind that there's a lot of people out there, right? There's this obvious correlation between conservatism and republicanism in the United States. Again, keeping in mind that those aren't the same thing. Republicanism is just a party with people who identify in different ways, and right, republicanism and democratism have switched several times places over the centuries. There's a lot of conservatives or people who call themselves conservatives, right? Because that's the big thing, is that, like, you know, people are calling themselves conservatives, which would lead you to believe that they, you know, subscribe to this notion of small government and all this stuff. But like Julia said, the very notion of relying on your government to restrict access to certain things, especially as it pertains to healthcare, especially as it pertains to what you yourself can do with your body or what anyone else can do with their body, that is not conservatism. That is really kind of like the most egregious of, you know, like government. I mean, it's government overreach, really, right? Like, if you look at the body, the individual as allegedly the prime beneficiary of government services, and then you look at that same individual and say, okay, if the individual is the beneficiary, then the individual's body should be, like, hands off, right? Like, we have two agreements. Government, you're going to work for me, and you're not going to touch me. And then the government says, okay, but we're going to have police, so if you don't listen to us, we can't touch you. And then, you know, you say, okay, that's the tacit agreement of, you know, violence, Weberian state violence in this society. I forget where I was going with that, but my point is, to Julia's point, conservatism and restricting abortion access from the top down do not go hand in hand.
And part of the question then becomes, well, then who's doing it, right? Because in the U.S., there's conservatism is conflated with the Christian right, and I don't know what else to call them, but, like, that's who it is. I mean, it is, they're, I guess you could call them fascists.
Well, Noam Chomsky.
Depending how you feel about that.
I've definitely mentioned this before. If I haven't, I will be very surprised. If you want to go back and look for it and then comment which episode I mentioned this in, be our guest. Noam Chomsky refers to people who consider themselves conservatives as radical statists. Right? Like, the idea being that they think they're being conservative, but what they're actually doing is giving radical amounts of power, wanting to give radical amounts of power to the state to pursue the agendas outlined by their, like, Christian values.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I do think it's helpful to put Christian in there because these are these are Christian values. And in the U.S., like, abortion wasn't always outlawed in the U.S. until Roe v. Wade, right? So that there's, like, an understanding that that's what happened. But for a long time, I mean, abortion has been around since pregnancy has been around, right? And so for a long time, it was something that was, like, hidden and secret and not necessarily, like, talked about publicly or openly, and had its own stigmas around and other, like, societal things around, but it wasn't always illegal, right? Until the Christian right decided to take up this this kind of issue for power, and then started doing some of these things that we know about. So going for, like, abstinence-only education, creating these videos with the science at the time. And it's important to recognize that the science is not politically neutral. I mean, nothing's politically neutral, right? Science is informed by power and has political goals and political ends to it. So the science at the time was heavily influenced by white men because that was right. Well, I mean, still now, but just stay with me. So before then, right, there was a lot of midwifery work. There were a lot of women providing care for women and really everybody, right? And some more, like, indigenous medical practices, and who knew so much more about the body. And then men came into play in the medical profession. This is a very, like, crude historical overview on this, and pushed out right, like saw this opportunity to like push out this group of people and kind of like create this space for themselves despite a lack of expertise, right? Like a lack of probably like interest or care too. And then started doing their thing, right? And creating like materials, putting out information with the technology that they had at the time. So I think there's often this idea that, well, they were doing the best that they could. And like, really, they weren't, because they were doing things terribly compared to how things were done before. And then they basically like pushed midwives out of the profession altogether. And so then, there are these like really, people would probably think they're really disturbing videos of like a fetus and what it looks like to get an abortion, like inside the body, right? And that this thing that's growing inside the body, that has a life. And if it's moving in some capacity, that means it's alive and it has a heartbeat and has this and it has that and the other thing. And putting out all this information to then shape the way that society viewed abortion, right? And so the radical status / Christian right used that then in their platform to gain all of this support and power to outlaw abortion. And what we know about a lot of that stuff is that it's nonsense. Like, it's false. We know abstinence-only education doesn't work. We know that as soon as somebody conceives, like, the baby is not alive. Like, organs are not developed until a certain point down the line, and there's no heartbeat, right? And there's no pain that's felt. And I probably should have mentioned this up front. I believe that abortion should be on demand and that it should be free, and that it should happen regardless, like whenever somebody needs it and wants it. And so even if the fetus can feel something or has a heartbeat or whatever it is, it's still not the fetus's decision to stay in there. It's not the fetus's body. So I think that's important to put out there too, because as I'm saying some of those things, like obviously that's coming from a very specific place. I don't remember originally where we started with that. The conservative piece. And being like clear about the language. And I think that piece is really important because it's also informing a lot of other laws that are coming into play. And this continued drastic shift to, there's never really been a separation between church and state, but this continued drastic shift to this more like Christian right state that points to the loss of many, many more rights that have been established, especially since the opinion on Roe cited the 14th Amendment, which protects contraceptive access, gay marriage, interracial marriage and relationships, and like privacy in general. So all of those things could potentially be up for
judicial review.
Yeah.
Which it is important to note that just because they're up for judicial review or scrutiny by the court doesn't mean they're like secure at this point. When we talk about privacy laws and things like that, there's already some pretty egregious violations of like that stuff going on. So this would just be codifying. Anyway, think the Patriot. Anyway, not going into all that yet.
One thing that I was curious about, and we might end up jumping around, one of the things that has come up a lot that is, it's really frustrating to see. And I get on the surface level why a lot of people do it. And probably if I were to like look at the demographics of who does it, it's probably mostly white women. But there's this comparison between, and it's always women's bodies and not like people's bodies. And the language around that is important because we know that not only women get abortions, reproductive rights affect fucking everybody, right? Like, it's not just the person. I mean, obviously, it has a very different impact on the person who is going to be forced to give birth, but it also heavily impacts everybody in society. So it's false to claim that it's a women's issue. I mean, it's a societal issue about rights and well-being. While I'm here, I'm also going to point out that suggesting that all penis-having men need, or penis-having people need or should be required to have vasectomies is an egregious violation of bodily autonomy. And, like, I get it. Like, I get it, because yeah, that would be nice. It would be nice not to be the person that has to pay for birth control and worry about birth control and worry about the severe consequences of getting pregnant and living somewhere in a state where you don't have access to abortion, or can't pay for it, or can't travel outside the state because then you might be locked up. Or if you have a miscarriage, you might be locked up and jailed because they don't believe you that it was a miscarriage and they think that you aborted your child. Or that it puts you in a dangerous situation in your relationship and your partner might kill you, right? Those are all the very real consequences of the decision that the Supreme Court made. And also, wishing for somebody to have fewer rights than you and to also not have bodily autonomy is really not the way forward around that. I just stop doing that. But where I was really going with what was really frustrating to see is this comparison, or this statement that women's bodies are more heavily legislated than guns. And there's this whole, like, you know, folks who are anti-abortion are pro-gun and pro-death penalty. And so, like, where's the division there? Like, what does that mean, right? Because these people think that they're pro-life. They want these babies to pop out, and they'll adopt your babies. Also, stop telling them to go into the foster care system and adopt babies who are already there. We don't want them adopting babies. That is fucked up, okay? Like, those poor kids have enough shit going on. They don't need to go into those families with horrible people. So, I guess I'm curious, like, what your thoughts are on, like, anti-abortion folks being pro-gun in particular. I mean, the pro-death penalty thing, I mean, I'm also curious about, but because gun legislation has been so talked about and so ignored all at the same time, and the Supreme Court made a decision around that too, right? That, like, New York had to get rid of their concealed carry law, and so they've kind of doubled down on the Second Amendment right to have weapons at the same time that Congress passed some gun legislation. So I guess I'm just kind of curious, like, what your thoughts are on the whole, like, anti-abortion and pro-gun situation. I don't have any, like, more kind of specific questioning about that, but
Well, I'm probably not going to have a very specific answer. I do want to point out that since our last broadcast, there have been several high-profile mass shootings. And, like, 2 of them have happened within the past 2 months. So that's, I mean, it's a question that makes a lot of sense, right? And I guess that's just to point out that besides, you know, this other recent ruling around concealed carry from the Supreme Court, just the conversation has been on people's minds, right? Like, you know, the responses, right? The reactions of, you know, pro-gun folks being like, well, we need more good guys carrying guns, right? Like, that kind of, you know, these questions of gun rights, gun laws, gun control have been at the forefront of people's consciousness. So I think that's part of what we're seeing is this confluence of, you know, factors in the media cycle, right? Like, oh, it's like we're all thinking about guns. We're also all now thinking about abortion, right? So, like, let's, yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense that comparison would come up. I think I mean, I don't necessarily have a problem with it. The idea that women's bodies are more regulated than guns. I mean, I think as far as conservative. Okay, so one, I think the conversation around gun regulation is kind of defunct. And not in the sense that it's pointless, but I think the way most people go about it, I know personally, I don't have a really good comprehensive understanding of all of the regulations that go into. So I guess if we're talking about federal regulations, right? Because different states have their own regulations for gun ownership, what that takes. I don't have a good understanding of the federal mandates around that. So I think given the way it looks in the states, in the different states, it, yeah, no, I think it's a silly comparison. As a marketer, I think it's compelling. I think it gets people thinking, like, oh, is that true? And I think it works because, again, I don't think most people have a really solid understanding of, like, what gun regulation looks like federally or in their, like, the many individual states versus, all of the different ways in which women's bodies are regulated, and specifically as far as abortion access, which seems like the major one, and I would hope there really isn't anything more than that, but I think that's part of the value of the question.
Anything more than what? What do you mean?
As far as regulating women's bodies?
Oh, well, I mean, forced sterilization is still legal in some states.
Right, hysterectomies. So, yeah, I mean, there you go. So I think, okay, so as far as, like, rhetoric, I think it has the potential to be a compelling comparison. And where I would hope people go with that is to say, oh, okay, so one, is that true? But regardless of whether or not it's true, taking the time to dig in deep and say, okay, so, like, in what ways are women's bodies regulated by the state, right? Because that's something that we should definitely look at and definitely have an understanding of, right? Because here, just now, we came up with two, abortions and hysterectomies, right? And there's a whole bunch of other things that I'm sure are on the books that we don't know, right? And that's, again, on a federal level and on a state level, right? Someone said something, I saw it on social media. I didn't corroborate it, and I don't really remember what it is, but they were like, some weird law, like it's still illegal to do some weird thing. It was like a Texas thing, right? In Texas, it's illegal to own more than 6 dildos, right? So that's right. If that's true, right? With the thing being, it's not illegal to own more than 6 guns, obviously, in Texas. The idea being that if we look at, like sex toys as something that can be regulated, right, and have some sort of impact on women's bodies, then that's another one, right? Like, why are we regulating sex toys? Like, to what end? Right?
One of the things, and I guess I don't really know quite what my question is, but to me it's like really striking, and I think this is something that's come up a lot, and part of the conversation around it annoys me a lot, and part of it too, like, I wonder if there's more underneath there, which is if you are, like, for pro-life people who are also pro-gun, despite all of the gun deaths in this country and all of the damage that happens because of guns, including killing people and children, like, how does that get reconciled?
Yeah. I mean, I think, like, what I think of in that case is, I mean, it's like you said, right? It's the difference between being conservative and being, like, a Christian conservative. Or, right, being conservative and being a Christian radical statist. If you're actually conservative, then that's consistent, right? Like, if you're actually conservative, it is, it's not consistent, sorry. If you're actually conservative, what your position would be, and this isn't to say that, like, there is a way to be conservative, but the more conservative you are, the more likely you are to be in favor of unrestricted gun rights, in favor of unrestricted access to abortion, in favor of cutting social welfare programs, and really that includes like institutions like prison and like police presence, state, like government police forces and everything. So our conservatives, radical statist Christians, are in favor of unrestricted, access to gun stuff, and severely restricted / prohibited abortion access, right? So they've got one of the two. And then what was the other one? Social welfare, they're against social welfare programs. So they've got two of the three. And they're very pro-police and pro-tough on crime prisons and stuff, right? So, like that was 4 things, right? That like, if you're conservative, you would be in support of these things. Our conservatives in the States are in support of 2 of those things, right? Small government when it comes to guns, and small government when it comes to social welfare. That's really important to keep in mind, because like to Julie's question, and like it's not even like so I think in terms of the again marketing, abortion access, comparing that to, or being pro-life in the context of restricting abortion versus being pro-death penalty in the context of crime and punishment, that's a good comparison, right, to make as far as pointing out the contradictions. Personally, and I know this is a thing that you're on as well, is I like the comparisons when they take it all the way through, right? Because in those 4 things, right, if we're talking about access to gun control, actually we can leave that one out, right? If we're talking about abortion access, if we're talking about social welfare programs, and if we're talking about crime and punishment, right, the things that we need to keep in mind are the factors that contribute to the health of not just families, not just individuals, but communities, right? In this country, right, and I would say one of the big things besides, one of the big things in this country actually is Christianity, right? The role and shape of Christianity in this country is pretty distinct, right? Christianity here, Protestantism, doesn't look like a lot of Protestant or even Catholic, a lot of Catholic or even Protestant Christianity's Christian practices in Europe, right? There's a lot of reasons for that. And I would say, so one thing is Christianity. The second thing is race, right? The big reason for that, for the difference, is race, right? Christianity here had to deal with the hypocrisy of being hella racist and promoting slavery, right? Like, that there's no real way around that, is that like, American Christians, especially in the Southern Baptist tradition, especially in the white Southern Baptist tradition, but also to a degree in the black Southern Baptist tradition, had to come up in a way where like there were just outright contradictions in front of them every day, and they had to live with them and reconcile them and enshrine those contradictions into the way they lived and understood the world and understood this country. So when it comes to...
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you...
Just going to say, which they'll continue to do as they continue to get their own abortions, but, outlaw it for everybody else.
Right. Yeah. So when it comes to really everything, right? When it comes to abortion access, in Europe, right, they'd be like, okay, yeah, that makes sense, right? Like even in nature aborts, right? Like that's a thing, at the very least in the first trimester, right? So like it really makes no sense. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that. But as far as the abortion, right, the pro-life versus pro-death penalty contradiction, right? And if you look at everything in between that, right, what takes someone from being born to receiving death penalty in this society? There's a lot of things. There is access to education. There's access to healthcare. There's access to jobs, right? Access to economic opportunity. Access to upward mobility, right? And even upward mobility in the economic feature is important because upward mobility doesn't necessarily mean you're less prone to commit crimes. It means you're actually less prone to be charged with crimes or for people to care about crimes, right? Like, even Bernie Madoff, right? Like, did not receive the death penalty. No one received the death penalty for white collar crime, right? So there's this poverty element to it. There's a clear racial element to it as far as who gets the death penalty. There are all of these elements, right? And what reasonable people say is that if you're going to be pro-life, you should be pro-life from the moment of whenever you think life begins, through birth, through life, right? Through the entire lifespan. You cannot be pro-life in that sense if you're anti-social welfare programs in this country, because we just have to recognize that people don't have, there's this notion of equality of opportunity. And I guess, I mean, honestly, like, I could keep going on down a whole bunch of rabbit holes, but I think, because when we get into the equality of opportunity pieces, that's a thing that I've noticed. People assume we have that, right? So if you don't know, there's this debate between equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. People say, oh, you want everyone to be alike, right? Critical race theory, they want everyone, socialism, they want everyone to, so they're talking about equality of outcome. Everyone gets the same thing in the end, right? And they're saying that that's what we want because we already have equality of opportunity, right? So we're not satisfied with the education we have. We're not satisfied with jobs. We're not satisfied with all this stuff, right, that we have as far as opportunity, right? Brown versus Board of Education. We have now the opportunity to go to the same schools, right? Integration, right? That is seen as equality of opportunity, right? But the fact of the matter is, equality of opportunity in a lot of ways is more of a myth today than it was when the Brown decision was made, right? Like, it's more of a myth today than it was during the times of separate but equal, right? Yeah. And I think that goes into the responsibility arguments where people are like, oh, women should just be responsible. Obviously, a lot more goes into that, But when they're like, oh, women should just be more, discerning about who they have sex with or like who they have babies with or, whatever. It goes into that. It goes into the whole crime thing, right? Oh, like it's their choice, right? Like, oh, they shouldn't have done these crimes. We all have the same opportunities. I came up just like they did, blah, blah, blah. It goes into, there's a fundamental lack of understanding of how our society is structured, how unfairly our society is structured, that informs a lot of people's opinions. And I think that pro-life versus pro-death penalty thing I do think it's useful. It's a useful starting point, but I think in order to really flesh it out, it needs to cover a lot more bases, than just those two.
Yeah, I mean, because the pro-life people are also, they're pro-fetus, right? They're not pro after that baby comes out. They're not pro the person carrying the baby either, right? If we look at the society that we live in where there is a serious formula shortage right now because of the formula plant that shut down, right? Like for capitalist reasons, then got back up. Then there was an issue with it, right? And like the government had, there's could have done something and didn't, right? So now there's that crisis that's going on. There's no paid family leave, right? There's no national policies around paid family leave. There's no universal health care, not even for children. Right, like social programs have been cut. The child tax credit that lifted so many kids out of poverty cut. Right, so we don't live in a society that values everybody's life. And so this idea to like slap this label of pro-life on when really like this overturning of Roe in some states means that people who are pregnant, they're going to die, and they're not going to die from a botched abortion only. They're going to die because of an ectopic pregnancy for which an abortion is the treatment, or a miscarriage that the body doesn't fully discharge is the treatment, and the doctors are going to have to be on the phone with lawyers to figure out if they can do that and can only do it if things get to a certain point. Right? That's not pro-life. I mean, you're sacrificing the person carrying that child, supposed child, right? Like, and for what? And then what's going to happen, right? Like, yeah, I mean, I appreciate, thanks for letting me ask that super vague question, because a couple other things I realized too is, like your language around marketing. Like, I mean, I realize part of what feels so bothersome about this, like, women's bodies are more heavily legislated than guns. Because it's not necessarily that I, like, disagree with that statement, because, yeah. I mean, like, the fact that I don't get to choose what I want to do with my body, but I can go buy a machine gun and shoot a bunch of people up, like, you know, within an hour. I mean, that's quite alarming to me, really. But part of it is that Roe being overturned and people losing bodily autonomy is so egregious, it does not need to be compared to something else for it to stick out as being egregious. We don't need to make comparisons about, like, how awful it is. Like, it's awful. And that comparison piece to me, I think, is really beyond frustrating, even though it probably helps some people understand the consequences of it. I think that is I don't really know what the right language is around it. I mean, that's fundamentally problematic to me, that wouldn't be, right, like a cause of concern for everybody, that it needs to be compared, like a body now needs to be compared to like a gun or something else, like for people to understand the grave consequences of that. And this idea too around marketing. I mean, it feels very much like with the pink pussy hats thing. Like it does feel like that piece too, right? To kind of like rile people up in this way, that to me doesn't feel helpful. And I don't mean that to like invalidate people's feelings. There's a lot of righteous anger and feeling angry. I mean, I would be surprised, like people who aren't angry, like people who are celebrating this. I mean, it's devastating. And so like the anger I understand, and also I don't like directing it in that way that feels like kind of consumerist, because it's also based in like, you know, like these memes or like these t-shirts or this whatever it is. And it just feels like really icky to me. And also like it's been that way for a really long time for a lot of people too. Maybe that's the other piece of it, right? Like a lot of people have not had access to reproductive care for a really long time. And so I think this like sudden like realization for a lot of white women and white people, because it's like, you know, white men too and people across the gender spectrum around that. It's frustrating in that way that they're all of a sudden now making this comparison between bodies and guns in that capacity without, I don't know, considering like what little they know about American history, or just like then imagining other people's lives, I guess.
I think you expect a lot from people. I think, I mean, obviously as a marketer or someone who does marketing, I think it makes sense, right? There's those kind of tools, heuristics, are, I mean, at the very least, inevitable, you know, and at the very most helpful to help get the message across to people. So I don't necessarily have a problem with it. I agree, right? Like it would be nice to live in a world where people understood the gravity of the issues that we understand to the same degree of depth that we understand them. But we don't live in that world, you know. But I mean, that's part of the mission, is to help people, help create that world, right, of awareness. And that's where marketing comes
in. Well, and I guess to that point too, I would ask, I guess it does feel like a point, like a reflective opportunity to like ask, like what about that comparison, and not like you necessarily, but just in general, like if people have found that comparison to be helpful, like what about it has been helpful, and what does that mean about you and your life and your understanding of your societal position, and what you know and understand about the world, and maybe what you're missing out on. And I don't mean that in a judgmental way either. I just mean that in a sincere, honest, like, consideration to understand yourself more deeply and the indoctrination more clearly.
While y'all type that in the comments, I do want to, I'm going to quick rundown of my own views on abortion, because you shared yours earlier, and mine are different. I want to let people know that. And I don't remember how much we discussed it in the last abortion episode that we did, but, I think again, right, nature aborts in the first trimester, like, often. It's very common. So I think, I think if we were to replicate that in law, as far as enshrining protections, easily, like, boom, bap, like, that should be the standard, right? Is that, like, at the very least, non-negotiable, non-arguable abortion protections up to through the first trimester. I feel like we could, like, that's the kind of law, right? And the reason I say, like, nature, right, is because, one, that's the way it is, right? Like, it's observable, it's scientific, right? Like, you can defend, like, scientists, doctors, whoever, can go to court and argue this point irrefutably, and probably in a very compelling way, possibly. I mean, it depends, not everyone's compelling. But my point is, this is one of those things that could, when Julia mentioned the 70% of people, and that's today, right? Keeping in mind that, like, as the decades have gone on, abortion has become more and more polarizing of an issue. But 30 years ago, 50 years ago, I mean, I guess 50 years ago was Roe v. Wade, roughly. Yeah, but even 50 years ago, right? Like, abortion was not this polarizing, right, of a subject across the political spectrum, right? So I would wager to guess that 70% that exists today was even higher decades ago, right? So my point is, right, this isn't one of those things that's really difficult to, at least when we're talking about finding a common ground, it's not difficult to do, right? There's no, like, biologically, there's no argument to be made against abortion within the first trimester, right? Even in, like, a humane sense, except for the life begins at conception argument, which is exclusively religious. If you're talking about life in the, then you're talking about life in the divine sense, which, that's not going to hold water in court, right? Or shouldn't hold water in court. So if we're talking about life in a scientific sense, first trimester, right? And I bring that up because that should be an easy starting point for us, right? The question then becomes, okay, after the first trimester, where do we regulate this? Where or how do we regulate this? Because I am sympathetic to the idea of no regulation of abortion access at all. I'm also, not 100% sympathetic to that idea, right? I get why it would be important, and I also, right, like the so I guess to put it into different words, and this is probably what happened in the last episode that we talked about this as well. I don't really know how to talk about this yet because I don't really, I don't think there should be a hard law. I think I like to look at the nuances, understand the big picture, and I think the conversation around abortion is so dogmatic and divided between either 100% abortion access or 100% abortion restriction, that it's not even clear when we're talking about where the majority lies as far as the 70% who are for some degree of abortion access. It's not clear where that line is. I think that line should at the very least be 23, 24 weeks, right? That gives people plenty of time to understand whether or not they're pregnant. It gives people, theoretically, right, plenty of time to do something about that, right? Decide whether or not they want to keep it, It gives people time to prepare, time to do whatever needs to be done, right? And I also recognize that everyone's body isn't the same. Some people aren't going to know within that time period, right? So there should be, right, like there's room to move the bar, right? Some people aren't going to know until like 8-9 months. Some people aren't going to know until they give birth. So these are the things where I think it gets murky. But I guess I want to share this because I'm frustrated at the dogma within the landscape, right? There's so little nuance in what could be a very nuanced conversation. And anytime there's a lack of nuance, we're leaving something on the table, right? So I want to know what's being left on the table, right? Like, where could we find accord? Where could we find agreement? Where could we establish, like, the least common denominator and move up from there? But since as a society we haven't done that, right, we just have this nebulous figure of like 60 to 70% of people who are for some degree of abortion access, but we can't operationalize what that means, right? Like, we can't operationalize whether they're talking about 6 weeks or 15 weeks or 24 weeks or like 2 trimesters or whatever, right? Like, we don't know where that line lies. And I think it's really important for us to make efforts to figure out where that line lies. Right? If that had been done at some point on a national scale over the past several decades, we would have had something to work towards, right? As far as securing a baseline, right? It's not necessarily, right, if you're pro 100%, like abortion rights throughout the entire term of pregnancy, then, that's not going to be particularly attractive, as far as like securing that baseline, But if your like priority is to secure some level of abortion access, right? As we were talking about with, democratically, right? If the majority of people are interested in securing some level of abortion access, then we should have engaged in that project, right? To figure out, okay, where is the line? What do we do federally? What can we do federally to make sure that happens? Go ahead.
Well, I think that's always the thing in terms of like progress, right? There's always this end goal, and then it's like doing the things to get there, and that would be like one step along the way, right? I imagine that the 70% of people who support abortion access in some capacity support it at the first trimester for all of the reasons that you mentioned. There's also like a really important piece to mention in all this too, that most people don't know they're pregnant for many weeks. Right? So like the way that pregnancy dating is determined is by the date of when your last period started. Now, social media has been very good for me for a couple reasons. One is I have realized just how little a lot of people know about menstrual cycles and general anatomy, which honestly, like, just mind-blowing and so devastating. But anyways, so in terms of like the menstrual cycle, it starts typically for a lot of people 2 weeks after that is a period of ovulation, right? Like, you typically can only get pregnant when you're ovulating, which is only like, I don't know, a max of like 36 hours, maybe 3 days, right? It's a very short window. And then, right, like, a week and a half, 2 weeks later, your period comes. Or maybe it doesn't come because we're not fucking clocks, right? So then a lot of people like wouldn't know. Maybe something happened, right? Like maybe they're a little bit extra stressed. Maybe things are just a little bit off. Maybe they have PCOS. Maybe something else is going on. And then they don't find out that they're pregnant, right? Until like whenever it is. And then it's determined they're like 6 or 7 weeks along. And so these states with these like 6-week heartbeat bands or whatever, people don't even know they're pregnant at that point. A lot of people, right? Unless they're like actively trying to conceive and testing regularly. And even then, they might not know because some people's menstrual cycles, TMI, mine is not 28 days, right? So like by the time I could be pregnant, I could find out, I could be testing every single day. I might already be at week 5 or week 6 because of the length of my menstrual cycle. I just think that's important to mention when we talk about trimesters and weeks pregnant.
Yes.
Continue.
So, I had something that, I don't know if it was about that. But definitely thank you for sharing that. I think, oh yeah. So like, I mean, to that point, and to my earlier point, right? I don't think, I guess what my position is not so much that, abortion access, abortion protections for the first trimester and then like restricted for the rest of it. What I'm saying is that we need that baseline, right? And I think that baseline is comfortably, the first trimester is perfect, right? So up to 20 whatever weeks, right? So we do have plenty of time to know those things as far as typically.
You understand that a trimester would be?
How many weeks? I don't know.
12 to 16 weeks.
Oh, really? Okay, well then maybe more than a trimester. Like 20, I think 22 weeks. From what I understand, 20 weeks is about...
I don't know.
I mean, I don't know either.
4 months, 16 weeks.
Okay, 16 to 20 weeks. All right.
3, 6, 9, 3 months, 12 weeks.
16
Math
to 20
is so
weeks.
hard.
We can, yeah. I mean, right, because if you're talking about
weeks.
from the first period, well, and it's
but
like,
that's
it's
the
a
first
40
trimester. That's what I'm saying. I mean, that's part of my thing.
Yeah.
Go on. Anyways, 20 weeks would be
16 to 20 weeks. Hard line. Anyway, yeah, my point is we need that baseline buffer zone. It could be whatever it is, right? I would say 16 to 20 weeks. And roughly lines up with the first trimester with some time, afterwards into the second trimester. But as far as like, advanced high-level fetal development, that is not really happening until, especially when we're talking about the nervous system, until after 20 weeks, maybe 22, 23, 24 weeks, typically. So we have that buffer zone at the beginning, give people plenty of time, so to speak, and the resources to be able to maximize that time to figure out what needs to be figured out. And then for the rest of it, we play it by ear, right? We see what happens. I don't believe in like absolute restrictions of abortion access really at any point during that whole thing, right? Because as Julia alluded to earlier, right, and as we mentioned again in the last podcast, like, yes, there are a lot of people who get abortions simply for want of not having a child, right? I think that was the most common reason that people get abortions, right? But other very common reasons include like serious medical conditions, right? Life-threatening medical conditions, things like that. And you don't want to take that stuff off the table, right? And you also want to keep in mind that not everyone who is like, I don't feel like having a child, is in that place for like on a whim, right? I think that's another misconception that a lot of people get is that they're like, they just don't want the responsibility of taking care of, a child, blah, blah, blah. It's like, put yourself in someone else's, shoes. Like they could be dealing with, there's just any number of things they could be dealing with as an individual within their community. You don't know where they're living. You don't know what kind of situation they're in. You don't know what their family situation is like, right? Like there's some, like you alluded to earlier, there's some places where you wouldn't wish a child to be in that environment, right? So, and who better to be the judge of that than the person who would be bringing them into that environment? So let people exercise their best judgment, because going back to the consequences piece, right? Restricting abortion access. So here's another thing, right? Because there's this totalizing narrative that like it's not going to have any effect. Restricting abortion access is going to make people think twice, right? That's a fact. The other fact is it's not going to stop people from having sex the way people are having sex, right? It's not going to stop people from getting pregnant. It's not going to stop people from wanting abortions, right?
Or getting them,
right? So those are things we need to pay attention to. Yes, it's going to make people think twice. No, it's not going to get rid of the need for abortions, right? So people are still going to be aborting. And Julia, you were telling me this a few days ago, and I saw an Instagram post the other day that really like put it all into perspective, right? Like the number one cause of death for pregnant women, right? And this is wild. Like, I hadn't thought of it like this, but the number one cause of death for pregnant women is murder, right? Is homicide. You think about it, as a society, it makes sense, right? Like, who's going to go up and like harm a pregnant woman? Like, you think about, all the care that goes, right? But the other side of that is someone doesn't want this child, right? Like, when we think of pregnant people, we think of typically like someone who's bringing someone into this world, and we want to care for them to make sure that they can bring someone into this world, right? But we always have to recognize that that's not the case for everyone, right? For a lot of people. And this fact made me think about the international scene as well, right? Because that's definitely not just a national phenomenon, right? Thinking India, thinking like, places where like population booms, so many communities on the continent, right? Like in Africa, my continent. This stuff happens, right? Like people get pregnant and it's like, oh no, we don't want that child, right? Get rid of that child. And if you can't get rid of the child, you get rid of the person who's carrying the child, right? They said like it's here in the States, 3 per every 100,000. 3 pregnant women are killed for every 100,000 like births. That's a lot, right? That's more than the number of people who die from lightning strikes and shark attacks and like a lot of things combined every year.
And doesn't take into account the number of women, especially Black women, who die in childbirth.
Right, which is 3 times higher than the rate at which white women die from childbirth, right? And like we haven't even, we can't even jump that hurdle, right? When we're talking about equality of opportunity and equality of outcome, right? Like we still don't even have equality of opportunity in like delivering children, right? Like doctors still aren't listening to Black women. Like it's just ridiculous that this is where we are.
Mm-hmm. And the people who are most likely to be murdering the pregnant people are their partners, right? Like as with all gender-based violence, it's partners or family members.
Glad you mentioned that.
The piece that you mentioned about like simply not wanting to have a child, I take a small issue with the word simply, because there's so many reasons to not want to have a child. And I know like that you didn't mean it in that way, but just to clarify, it's much more like the last part of that like piece that you mentioned, right? Like the environment you might be bringing that person into, what your life looks like, what your ability is. This economy, right? Like any number of things that are going on in the world. And I'm clarifying that for folks. I don't think like anybody needs to have any specific reason or needs to give anybody a reason for wanting an abortion. But I think that's important to mention because, you're right. There is this idea that, like, people are just, like, willy-nilly all out having abortions. And some people are. Like, that's fine. And also, the number of, like, late trimester abortions is so low. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist or doesn't happen. But this idea that, like, you're killing a child that could, like, live outside the womb. It's, like, very few people are doing that. And yeah, I mean, so, and there are both sides of it. And I think like often to defend abortion, people go to the like, the more sympathetic sides of things, right? Like, okay, well, you know, an 11-year-old can't do like all of these things on their own. They can't vote. They can't buy like cigarettes. They can't like go to a PG-13 movie. They can't do all these things, but now you're going to force them to have a child, right? Or like somebody who has a terminal illness, now you're going to force them to have a child, right? Or like somebody whose fetus has been tested and has a terminal illness, right? Who will likely be born and die within the first year of their life. Now you're going to force that birth. And I think there's also, so there are lots of those stories because those are more sympathetic, and those are also like what you described as more polarizing too, right? I mean, there's lots of people who simply like don't want to have a child, and like they should also have the right to have an abortion, regardless of what their decision is. We also haven't even touched on the impact on people's bodies of actually carrying a child, and we won't have time to do that today, but it's not you just like carry the child and then the child pops out and then like everything's, you know, like la-di-da like it was before and everything's the same. I mean, it changes your entire body. You're literally growing an entire organ and like giving life to something. Anyways.
I think the last thing that I want to share, or for now, because obviously there's much more, is this piece around, I forgot what it was, but it was something we were talking about earlier, and just connecting it to the politicians. If you want to like go ahead, because I need to remember what it was. Oh yeah, I guess it's like the consistency with the whole pro-life thing, right? Keeping in mind all the ways in which, you know, again, if you are pro-life, if you fancy yourself a pro-life voter, I guess it's the way in which pro-life voters relegate the notion of pro-life to this exclusive piece, and how we really allow that to happen, right? So part of what happens anytime we engage in debates like the abortion debate, and even like now, right? It's important to talk about these things, and I'm not saying that we're like feeding into this thing, but like if all we did was respond to what was going on in the news, what we're doing is we're validating that subject as a priority, right? Especially when we're talking about politics, right? So if you go out there and you're like, I'm just a casual, you know, person who likes to talk about things, but when people talk about abortion, I get in, you know, I don't like to talk about politics, but when it comes to abortion, I get in there and I talk about it, right? What you're doing is you're validating the idea that abortion can take up this much space in the political discussion, right? And what that does is it, you know, perpetuates the reality of electing people who will continue to do everything else, right? If abortion, and that's what single issue voting does, right? With abortion, with gun rights, with whatever the fuck else, right? You know, which is why Medicare for all was kind of like refreshing, right? Because even if you're a single issue voter for Medicare for all, that covers a lot of bases, right? Not to say that it's the best, right? It's not the ideal. It's still single issue voting, but it's a big issue, right? Like it covers a lot of bases. All of these things are big issues, but how many bases do they cover? So, you know, my point is, the more attention we devote to abortion without putting it in the context of something bigger, like healthcare, right? Like bodily autonomy, like the amount of influence the government has over our daily lives, right? And connecting those dots, the more we're legitimizing the politicization of not even the politicization, the more we're legitimizing the abortification of our politics, right? Like what we're saying is, you know, like I don't really care about politics except for abortion, and then abortion becomes your politics, right? And when abortion becomes your politics, regardless of what side you're on, then everything else goes out the window, right? People are only going to run on abortion. I mean, that's, again, it's what people were doing. And then, like, we're electing people who aren't even doing anything about it because they're leaving it up to the Supreme Court, right? Mm-hmm. So just keeping that in mind for abortion, for gun rights, for any single issue that's on the table, is that it's always imperative to take whatever that is and expand it, right? Like include that thing in the bigger picture. And when we do that, not only do we keep a more robust notion of what our politics are and can be and should be, but we also make it more difficult for people to, like poke holes in arguments, right? Like we have fewer contradictions in our understandings of abortion and gun rights and Medicare for all these things.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate that because I think everything's interconnected, right? And like part of the way that this whole system in the States works, right, is that this abortion has become a women's issue. But like I said before, it's not a women's issue, it's a community issue for the greater good of the entire country, right? And it impacts everybody in different ways and all of the different like community institutions that we have. But because it becomes a women's issue, or when it's like a gun rights issue, or when it's, when people talk about like racism and it like, oh, well, it's a black community issue. Like, it's not. It's none of those things, right? Like, we can't afford to have sections of people or like groups of people in any capacity targeted in that way to like then, right, like put them out on an island and have them trying to fight against this incredibly powerful system, right? That's all working the way that the radical statists, right, like want it to work, where they can just keep like gobbling up all of this power and directing like hate towards certain groups and keeping these kind of like creating these divisions of folks who then aren't connected to other people, right, in order to build these networks to fight back and push back and like demand their rights. And I think that's something else that I find really frustrating about some of these memes is that like, yeah, there are all these laws and stuff, but like, you don't tell me what I do with my body. Like, you cannot. Like, there are plenty of ways to and I mean not plenty, but there are ways, right, like that we can take back that autonomy and have that autonomy, right? Like, those systems do not grant that or give those things to us, and we need to be able to count on each other in our own communities. So by like thinking about and being able to explain the ways that abortion or gun rights or whatever these single issue things are that get you into politics, right? Like, you're really then like understanding how community operates, because abortion is not a single issue thing, right? I mean, it impacts so many people, at least the person carrying the child, the person who's coming out of that person, and the person who helped create that person, right? At the very least, there would be 3 people involved in that capacity, and we know that there's often many, many more. So yeah, I really appreciate you putting it into that perspective, because it's a community understanding of what's going on, as opposed to trying to just like cherry pick these few things, which we know that's not how like anything works, but that's how rights get taken away.
Yeah. And we didn't even get into like the downstream implications of like abortion prohibitions, right? Like, if we're talking about A Handmaid's Tale, or like the what do they call it? For fuck's
sake, stop dressing up like fucking handmaidens. Literally, that was taken from history. Jesus, stop doing that.
Or the Great Replacement theory or whatever, right? Like, even not going into that stuff, just recognizing that on some level of political consciousness, right, there are the people, or there's allegations that the people behind these decisions understand that something as simple as prohibiting abortion access can pay dividends decades down the line, as far as like cheap labor, right? If we ban abortion, and we don't invest any more, again, in social welfare, right? And we make sure that, like, there's a whole bunch of people who don't have any quality education or quality jobs or, like, basic
food,
necessities.
housing.
Right. Then we're going to have this labor force in our prisons who's going to be working for super cheap, making some companies, like, a lot of money, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's kind of
contracting
distant.
With states and...
Yeah.
Sorry. Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's hard to imagine the state thinking that far in advance, especially in the face of climate change and everything.
But that's not real, Kwadjo.
Oh, yes. Well, which is exactly why it's that much more difficult to imagine. But it's possible, right? Like, that's the kind of thing we should be imagining, right? Like, how can this decision, how can this issue really, like, be blown up? Whether or not it's conspiracy theory. Like, we need to think that big. Like,
Yeah. And, I mean, I don't know, like, what men say to each other around these things. Mm-hmm. And that makes me sad. And that's part of something I meant to mention before, too, right? Like, it really is a community thing. And so... yeah, I mean, I hope people are talking to each other, and, like, yes, by all means, like, feel all of the feelings, and also there's a lot of work to be done. So, there's this question of, like, what can I do? I want to do something. If you have money, the best thing that you can do is to give your money, and to not give it to Planned Parenthood, but to give it to local organizations, local abortion funds. We can put the link under here to look for. And I know that doesn't always feel glamorous, and it doesn't feel like you're doing something because you're not doing something. But if that's what you have, that's what you have, right? Like, we don't, folks who have been organizing for years and years and years for this don't need other people, like, jumping in and trying to do all these things and diverting all of these resources that ultimately are probably going to be, like, stolen by a bunch of white people and organizations, really, that aren't, where the money's not actually going to go where it needs to go. So give money, seek out these, like, abortion networks and groups, and see, like, if you want to try and volunteer, like, you can ask what they need, and see if you can get involved in there and build community. I mean, that's going to be a really important thing. And I don't mean community in the way of, like, if you need an abortion, like, I'll help house you. Like, don't put that stuff on social media or, like, digital surveillance. It's a huge difference between pre-Roe and now is digital surveillance. People will be watching you. So, like, learn about online safety and some of those things, and, figure out, like, what are some of your skills. Like, try and get connected with folks so that you can create your own community, because that's, I mean, really going to be the only thing, that keeps us safe.
And talk to people, right? Mm-hmm. Like, talk to your circle. Talk to your friends, your close family. Like, again, a lot of people like to avoid these conversations for fear of discomfort or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, again, we're either going to rely on the Supreme Court to overturn this decision, in which case the people need to create a society in which the Supreme Court seeks to do that, or we're going to elect someone who does something about this, right? In which case the people need to elect, right? So you are the people. The people you talk to are the people. So have these conversations. Whatever your views are, talk to someone with opposite views. Try to understand where they're coming from. Like, listen to them. Understand where they're coming from. What argument are they making? What is important to them about this situation, right? And understand it. And if you're on the pro-abortion side of things, do that so you can poke holes in their argument. The better you listen and the better you understand where they're coming from, the more you're going to be able to point out the contradictions. And that's not to be, like, super pragmatic with it, and, like, whatever, Machiavellian with it, but we're on a mission, So
if you have the capacity to do that, because I think there's another very real piece too where a lot of people have been doing that, and trying to argue your humanity to somebody else, does not. So like, that's really important.
Yeah.
And maybe like, also think about what you need to, and if you have somebody who's like really great at that, maybe you ask them to do that, right? Like, or if you're somebody who's maybe not directly impacted or something like that.
I would say you should practice it. Like, because I agree with that. Obviously do what you've got to do what you're going to do, but, at the end of the day, you are the person you can rely on the most, right? Like, if you rely on yourself to to know the other people around who are doing, who can make those arguments, then like do that. But if it's something you can afford to practice, because I think that's the other thing is people think of it, and I'm really going to keep it brief, as like this whole big thing that like you have to go through and do all this stuff, and it can turn into that, right? And it can feel really daunting, but it's also a practice. Like I just speaking personally, was not a fan of talking to people about anything, right? But I practiced a lot, to talk to people and like figure out how to make an argument and defend a point and like all this stuff. And now I really enjoy doing it. You don't have to enjoy doing it, right? Like, and yeah, it is daunting, it is scary, so you don't have to do it if you don't want to. But if you can find it in yourself to practice doing it, the more you practice it, the better you're going to get at it. And the fact of you practicing is often a signal to the people around you that you care, right, about whatever you're talking about, right? Because that's what you're practicing, is putting your values out there.
To reasonable people. Will think that you care.
Yeah. I mean, it's also a good like vetting mechanism,
Yeah.
It's good for
the way that you're describing it sounds very ideal. Like idealized in some ways, and like I'm just thinking about some of the conversations I have with even some like moderate folks, and I'm like, even when I've been very patient, and I'm like, right, like, because people on the other side who feel very strongly about it, they don't take everything that you're saying in the way of like, oh, they really care about this, so let me listen.
Well, yeah. I just mean like, the people you're close to, right? Like the people...
Yeah, I mean the people who matter in your life.
Right. And the more you do this, right, this is one of those things, we've mentioned this on the podcast before, like the more you put yourself out there and let your values be known and practice like making, right, don't necessarily practice making an argument, but practice listening and understanding, right? Because the better you can do those two things, if you really understand, you'll be able to see the holes, right? And then you'll be better at making the argument.
And maybe relationships.
That too, hopefully.
There'll be a whole self-selection process. You will be selecting, and they'll be selecting in or out.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is that, like, your circle's going to get smaller. Like, you're going to realize the more you do this that, like, you just can't be around some people, which is cool. Like, you don't need to be around everybody. So, practice your thing. Is that it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I guess so.
We'll see y'all at the next one. Got COVID, so maybe tomorrow.
Yeah. Take care of each other.
Yeah, for
and
sure.
yourselves.